Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com.
Hi, Shahin. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast show today. It's great to have you on.
Thank you.
So before we get into the sort of main part of our conversation, what we like to do is discuss a little bit about your origin story. So that's sort of things like what you studied at uni. Was it inevitable that you would end up in the role that you ended up in? And what are some of your sort of main career highlights that you've had along the way?
So I wanted to study biology when I was quite young in high school, and I miserably failed. So I ended up studying economics instead, economics and public affairs. So I went to university in France, went to grad school, both in Paris in a public affairs school and as well as in New York at Columbia University doing international affairs. And then I worked for an investment bank for many years as a macroeconomist, covering emerging markets first, and then Europe in particular during the Euro crisis. And then I moved on to public policy, and I was an economic advisor to the president of the European Council in Brussels for a few years in 2012 until 2014. And then an economic advisor to Emmanuel Macron when he was economy minister between 2014 and 15. And then went back to London and worked for George Soros for a few years. And now I split my time between a think tank in Germany, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and a geopolitical and macro advisory firm called Observatory Group. And I'm still quite involved in French policy and political circles.
Oh, excellent. That's really interesting and very, very timely as well, because obviously we are in the midst of the French legislative election. So I suppose that would be a good place to kind of start the conversation. So would it be possible for you to sort of, just for our sort of listeners' benefit, give a little bit of background to the French elections? Obviously, you have, as you mentioned, worked with Macron before. So perhaps a little insight into what his sort of plan was going into this.
Yeah.
And in that light, I suppose, how do you sort of interpret the results of the first round that we've sort of had already?
So I think what had been missed on the part of most foreign readers who get their news from VFT or The Economist is that France, since the 2022 general election, in fact, was run by a minority government. And so that created already a degree of political fragility. I think Macron was somewhat shocked and upset by the results of the European election. He also, I think, saw coming a very difficult, and I'm sure we'll discuss that later, a very difficult budgetary negotiating cycle in the fall, with the new fiscal rules in Europe coming into force and France's requirement to adjust its budget deficit quite significantly. So I think seeing that coming, he thought it was probably better to call for early elections and try to get either a new and revived political mandate if he could expand his majority. I think this was his first option, even though that was probably delusional. And B, if that were to fail, effectively, I think Macron's idea was that by allowing the Rassemblement National to govern the country now, we might prevent them from winning both the presidential and the general election in 2027. The first gambit, which was expand his majority, has failed. Effectively, the left-wing coalition was able to come together way better and way faster than I think he anticipated. Parts of the center-right with les Républicains did a deal with the Rassemblement National, which I don't think Macron foresaw. And last, Reconquête, another party of the far right, kind of collapsed and ended up, fueling additional support to the Rassemblement National. And finally, his own coalition also kind of weakened because, his former prime minister, Edouard Philippe, decided to run under his own party and umbrella outside of the presidential coalition. So all of that, signals a first failure. And I think the big question now headed into the second round is what will be the outcome? Will the Rassemblement National have an absolute majority or not? If not, will we be able to govern under a minority government scenario? That will be option 2. Or option 3, are we to have kind of a hung parliament with no government, even minority government possible, in which case Macron would probably have to form something akin to a technical government, caretaking government, or kind of a national unity government, option 3. At this stage, I still think that an absolute majority of the Rassemblement National is a distinct possibility, probably an underappreciated possibility. We have had over the last 3 days since the first round a lot of political bargaining and jockeying to limit the risk of an absolute majority, including through strategic choices made by parties to withdraw their candidates in places where their presence in the second round could undermine or could increase the chances of RN victory. Just for those who are not familiar, the French electoral system is a bit particular in that you can have a second round with 3 or even 4 candidates. Basically, you need to have 12.5% of the registered votes in order to qualify for the second round. And so that means that in some constituencies, you may have as much as 4 candidates. You had a number, in fact, you had more than 300 seats with 3 candidates for the qualified for the second round. And what has happened over the last 3 days is that 200 of them have decided to step down and not run in order to prevent an easy victory for the Rassemblement National. So that, I think, has limited the risk of an absolute majority, but has not brought it down to 0. And in particular, I think one critical variable is the possibility of very significant drop in the participation rate. We've had in the first round a record participation, the highest we've seen since 1997. If the participation rate drops significantly in the second round, that would advantage quite significantly the Rassemblement National and still open the possibility of an absolute majority. So I think this is what we'll know on Sunday night. What is customary in France after a general election is that the prime minister hands over his resignation to the president so that the president can appoint a new prime minister that is consistent with the new parliament. It's not certain that this will happen this time, because unless the Rassemblement National has an absolute majority, it might be that the prime minister stays on as a caretaking prime minister until either a new majority emerges or a new technical government of sorts is formed. So it might be that even after Sunday night, we are still left with a period of political and, as a result, policy uncertainty at a time, as I said earlier, where there are very daunting questions for France, in particular related to fiscal policy, given what I told you about the new fiscal rules and the need to prepare a multi-year fiscal adjustment plan by the fall. I think that would be an important point. And I'm ending there, an important discussion which may lead to another political crisis in the fall. Because if this new government that comes together now is unable to pass a budget in the fall, we may see another bout of political uncertainty and potentially political crisis.
Yeah, no, that's really, really useful. And I suppose it opens, as you kind of sort of alluded to, in the context of kind of what you sort of mentioned about Macron's plan around sort of giving them, I suppose, the RN enough rope to hang themselves if they get a majority this time, given that they'll have to deal with a lot of sort of difficult decisions around the deficit. Is, I suppose, for sort of French outlook and French assets in particularly, is it much more positive if they were to sort of cobble together a broad church sort of coalition to sort of keep going with Macron and the left and potentially a little bit of the centre-right, given, as you say, the difficulties that even with a slight minority he was going to be facing into the fall and the sort of the budget negotiations then? And just as a sort of add-on to that, what would a kind of technical government look like? Would it still need, presumably, majority assembly backing?
I think we're in a period where, in any case, it will be very difficult to summon a majority for a meaningful fiscal consolidation effort. In large part because actually this campaign, for instance, has not brought the topic of fiscal policy to the table at all. So I think an absolute majority for the RN would have troubles, getting a budget that is compliant with the EU rules through. And I think there will be, for this government, as well as for any, a real strategic choice. Either propose a significant fiscal adjustment and therefore potentially face significant resistance in the parliament, a motion of confidence, and that could overthrow the government, or decide to have a minimal adjustment, if any adjustment at all, and in that case, open a conflict with Brussels. And so I think there's really a quandary for the next year, for the next French government, whichever it might be, of choosing conflict internally or conflict with Brussels. And I see at the moment little in the way of a compromise between these two choices.
Absolutely. And just as a sort of side, how does the sort of Melenchon faction, far left, LFI, kind of fit into this dynamic? How did they outperform in the sort of first round, and could a sort of stronger performance of their sort of that party within the sort of left alliance really throw things into sort of uncertainty for the kind of idea of an anti kind of RN majority being formed?
So I think the presence of the far left of Mélenchon in that coalition has undermined the coalition, and at the same time, without this coalition, the left would have done a lot worse. So I don't think this alliance was a bad thing per se. What is clear today is even if the alliance did well in the first round, because of their incapacity to benefit from significant vote transfer, they were not going to be able to form a majority government after the second round. So the risk, or the policy risk related to this left-wing coalition is minimal. So I'm not, I think, for good and bad reasons, this left-wing coalition sadly is not in a position to govern, and is not going to play a central role in the policy process. There were some who feared that we could have kind of an ungodly alliance between the far left and the far right on a number of policy proposals, whether it be abrogating the pension reform or things like that. And I don't see that as very likely. I think there's a huge cost politically for the left to cooperate with the far right. And so I think it will hold off from that.
Absolutely. And just as a kind of, it's Macron said he won't resign as a president, which is obviously a very separate sort of issue to sort of being to the sort of legislative vote that's going on right now. So that for background, it's kind of the parliament, I suppose, the assembly being voted on. Is there anything that you see as a risk scenario that could lead to him resigning pre-2027? I suppose there is a sort of precedent for presidents resigning when they sort of lose referendums, etc. But is there anything kind of that could potentially cause that, I suppose? And what are his, I suppose, powers to kind of restrict a sort of prime minister who isn't sort of on his side? So say it was the majority RN, or if it was just a sort of a separate party to his own. What are his powers to kind of block that and kind of keep things in order, I suppose?
So the French system is very weird in the sense that when the president and the prime minister come from the same party, the executive is very unified, and most of the executive powers fall in the hands of the president. In a situation of cohabitation, when the prime minister comes from a different party than the president, the executive powers are divided, and the prime minister ends up having a lot more power, and the president has somewhat limited ways to limit and prevent the prime minister from acting, provided that prime minister also has a majority in the parliament. We may be in this odd situation now where we may have a prime minister that actually only enjoys a minority government. And so its ability to govern fully could be also constrained. I think the sum total of that means that what's more likely than not is a French political and policy process that is largely paralyzed, and one where the president can undermine his own prime minister and his actions, but cannot completely block him either. Constitutionally, the president has certain prerogatives. He's in charge of the commander of the armed forces, but even that, is being contested. So, Marine Le Pen recently said that, in fact, the title of chief of the armed forces was an honorific title, but didn't mean the president had the authority to launch a military operation. And that is true, is subject to, in principle, parliamentary approval. So, if the president decided to do, I don't know, like some kind of operation in Ukraine, for instance, this could be overthrown by the parliament.
That's very interesting because, I mean, there's definitely been some who say sort of in a cohabitation situation, the president basically will take control almost of the foreign policy whilst the PM sort of controls the domestic policy much more. And sort of,
I guess that was the case in times when essentially there were no major divergences between the prime minister and the president on foreign policy. In an environment like the one we're in today, where both on European and on foreign policy, the Rassemblement National and Macron would have quite diverging views, these frictions could be more significant.
No, that's really interesting. Thanks so much for that, the insight there. I'm just going to sort of jump across to, because obviously we've worked a lot with German policy as well. Just jump across to there because there's obviously a very interesting conversation there going on, or quite long-standing situation around the sort of German debt brake. So that's the kind of constitutional requirement for Germany to kind of balance, or pretty much balance its budget. I think it's like a 0.35% deficit it's allowed. In your view, in the kind of current situation of sort of obviously war in Ukraine, energy sort of being uncertain and sort of having to shift their sort of energy supplies, is this policy sustainable, and what are the kind of ways around it, I suppose, for a government?
No, it's a very good question, because as much as France is going to have a difficult time negotiating its budget for 2025, I think Germany is also in the midst of a very acute negotiation, and a difficult one, for its own budget. Not so much because of the European fiscal rules, but as you said, because of their domestic constitutional debt brake. I think the current coalition is kind of agonizing over this negotiation, and we might actually well see a coalition, a German coalition government, collapse over that negotiation. I don't think that's the central scenario, but I don't think it's a zero probability event that they would collapse. I would be mindful of that. What I find as relatively interesting and encouraging in Germany is, I think there is a growing consensus emerging around the fact that this constitutional debt brake is really holding Germany back, and that the investments that are necessary in infrastructure and digitalization, in energy transition, cannot be undertaken with this constitutional debt brake in force. And so my hope is that as soon as this budget for 2025 is passed, my hope is that the German conversation will turn to to their domestic general election campaign for 2025, and that this fiscal issue is going to be at the heart of it. And my bet is that after these elections in 2025, including, or rather in particular, if they lead to the election of a government led by the CDU, I think that could open the door to a meaningful reform of the constitutional debt brake. And that in itself, I think, would be positive for Germany, because I think it would relax a bit the fiscal constraints and enable a bit more public spending and public investment. But it may also, in turn, allow to reopen the negotiations about Europe's fiscal rules, which, as you know, have been negotiated for the past 2 years and are just now coming into force. But they're coming into force now at a time where we also know that they are in some ways unsatisfactory. And so, a German reform could potentially open the door to a more meaningful reform of Europe's fiscal rules.
That's really interesting. I suppose on that, it's quite an interesting point because, I mean, just for our listeners, it's kind of a sort of traffic light coalition in Germany right now between the sort of the Greens, the centre left, and then the sort of fiscally conservative sort of centrists. And as you mentioned, the sort of centre right CDU are kind of in line polling wise to sort of probably win the next election and take over. In order to sort of to change the constitution, they'd need, if I'm all correct, more than just a majority. They'd need a sort of supermajority, and probably the CDU would need help from the current sort of coalition partners, probably to change that. Do you think they would be able to get that support, or do you think the fact that the CDU has kind of been a bit of a sticker in terms of trying to sort of keep them to the debt brake in recent years is kind of going to scupper that plan? Does that make sense?
So the CDU is becoming internally divided over this issue. So the CDU at the national federal government level is still on paper very opposed to a reform of the fiscal rules. But you have a number of Länder minister president who are complaining about the fiscal rules. These fiscal rules also apply to at the Länder level, at the state level, and fiscal policy there is particularly tight. So I think that debate inside the CDU is progressing, and by then the Greens and I think the SPD will have come out in favor of a reform of the fiscal rules in the run-up to the 2025 election. So if the CDU ends up accepting one, even if the SPD or the Greens are in the opposition, they will support the constitutional amendment. Remember that you need a 2/3 majority to pass a constitutional amendment in Germany. So you will need the support of the Greens and or the SPD, in addition to that of the CDU, in order to pass a constitutional amendment.
Cheers for that. And just as a sort of final question on the German side, because it has felt that, as you say, publicly at least, it's been quite hard for German politicians to kind of challenge the debt brake. It's almost like a sort of, is it a sort of public perception issue? And I suppose the question is, why is kind of there's so much German support, or even amongst the public, it seems, within the sort of German psyche for kind of such sort of fiscal prudence? And how do parties need to overcome that? Or as you say, is it more...
It has become kind of a national totem, I think the German public has been sold for many years on the idea that this constitutional debt brake was a crucial element of Germany's economic policy success. In my view, wrongly so, but I think this has become a very popular idea. So much so that today, 60% of the German public, including supporters of the Greens or the SPD, are in support of the constitutional debt brake. And as a result, it's quite difficult for German politicians, even those who are convinced that it needs reforming, to openly argue for it and to make a strong plea for reform. So I think that's a big hurdle. But I think that's a hurdle that's also going to be able to be overcome through time when German citizens realize that the debt brake imposes very significant fiscal cuts and significant choices. So far, the German public hasn't felt that. And I think, it has started to feel it in 2024 with essentially climate policy needing to take a big step back because of the debt brake. And I think now we're going to see it more in this budget 2025 with yet more cuts to come as a result of the debt brake. So I think the German public needs to see firsthand the effects of the debt brake for being convinced that it can and should be transformed.
No, that's really interesting. So almost further pain, I suppose, on the tightening belts into the end of this year, and then potentially some relief next year if post-election, perhaps.
Yeah, more than next year, because the elections are late in 2025. You would only have a new government early 2026. A constitutional reform of that nature would at least take 6 months. So I think we're looking at, in the best of worlds, something that would have an effect in policy in 2027, not before that, sadly.
Very interesting. Hopefully that's not too late, given all the sort of crises going on. Thank you so much for your time, Shahin. We'd just like to sort of, I appreciate you sort of got to run soon, but we'd just like to sort of finish our kind of interviews with just a little bit about some of the sort of books that have inspired you, ones that you've sort of read recently that you would recommend. Is there sort of any that kind of spring to mind?
I've been reading a great book by somebody that I'm a big fan of called Philip Sands. I've been reading his last book called The Last Colony, about the islands of Chagos, decolonization of the islands of Chagos, which is a beautiful book about the role of international law in achieving self-determination. So it's a great book. And I've been trying to educate myself a lot about AI. I tend to be, I guess because I'm old now, on the more skeptical side of I was on the skeptical side on cryptocurrencies, and I'm also on the skeptical side of this AI revolution, which I think is a bit overblown. But I was reading a very interesting book, or online podcast rather, or online site called the Situational Awareness, which I thought quite good. So yeah, these are the two things I would recommend reading.
Cheers, thank you so much. And we'll post sort of links and sort of names of those books in our sort of when we post on the site. And just as a final, what is the best way to sort of for people who are interested in sort of hearing more of what you have to say, to follow you or your views online, or is that possible?
So I write regularly in DFT, The Guardian, but I'm also quite active on Twitter. So I think my Twitter handle is probably the easiest way to follow me.
Excellent, and we'll have that link down below as well. Also, thank you so much, Shahin. It's been really interesting talk and very sort of timely, given everything that's going on. So thanks again for being on. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.